The following show is brought to you in part by support from Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi. We don't just practice law, we make history. Online at rkmc.com.
Hello and welcome. I'm very pleased to introduce my leader to you tonight. Jim Klobuchar is with me. As many of you know, Jim was a columnist with the StarTribune for 30 years. He had a wonderful honor back in 1984. He was named the country's outstanding columnist for newspapers over 100,000 by his peers, which is the best kind of award. And in 2003, a very unique honor, he was nominated for the Pulitzer in journalism by the Christian Science Monitor, for whom he has been writing. He's also the president of Jim Klobuchar Adventures, and just returned from an adventure in Egypt. I'm just so pleased you could be here.
Well, thank
and
you.
Talk about leadership, and it's going to be kind of a two-pronged interview. I'll give you the broad outline. We're going to talk about leadership in journalism, and then we're also going to talk about his new book, which he wrote with Bud Grant, called Always on Sunday, and talk some about sports and leadership in sports. So we've got a full agenda here, Jim.
Well, it's a joy to be with you.
Thanks. Good to have you here. I should mention one more thing. He is the father of Meagan and Amy, and many of you know Amy Klobuchar, of course. So, busy family. Well, you're a real Minnesota boy. Grew up in Ely, went to the University of Minnesota, have lived here all your life almost, except for some time in North Dakota.
And in the Army.
And in the Army
yeah.
during the Korean War days, right? Were you in combat?
No, I went the other way to Germany, the luck of the draw. And, but it was a very important time in my life, and we had some missions in Germany. It was the time of the Cold War. And I treasure those years.
Do you?
And I've been trying to be active in Veterans Affairs
ever
the last few years, especially, and because of Afghanistan and Korea and Iraq.
Just in a nutshell, Jim, how would you say it changed your life in the biggest way?
At first, it introduced me to the world. I was lucky. I was not at risk directly. We were facing the Cold War, and we were facing a potential blow-up of the war. I learned discipline. I learned what the Army considers teamwork and how important it is. And it was formative for me in many ways that I don't think would have come to me for years afterwards. Being part of something larger than yourself.
Much larger. I want to go back and talk just a little bit about the days in Ely. I read that all four of your grandparents were from Slovenia. That's kind of unusual to have that solid a core of genetics from one area. Did your folks have education beyond high school?
My grandparents came from the little country of Slovenia, which is in the Balkans, and later became part of larger Yugoslavia. And of course now the countries that made up Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, and others have achieved independence. So it was a little enclave, but take yourself back 110, 120 years ago. There was poverty in this. It was ruled by Austria. The young men were subjected to conscription into the Austrian army. They knew of a country a long way off called America. And the godhead of their lives later, when they migrated here, was the education of their children, the education they never had. In those years when they were growing up, my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side remembered in later years in this country that in September the authorities would line the kids up in the city street and would choose 1 out of every 10 to go to school. And the others. So it became the grail of their lives to see their children educated. And that was a commitment. So you had, my immigrant story is everyone's story. My grandparents of 110 years ago coming here to this country with the flap on their lapel, unable to speak English, going to a mining country where the men could work underground for 10, 12 hours a day. In winter, there were days when they didn't see the sun. Had no education, learned broken English, became citizens proudly. And so the first generation of the kids could go to high school. The second generation could go to college. And the third generation, in my case, my daughter became a United States Senator. So this is the immigrant ethic of America. Yeah, but it is the story of millions of Americans.
Well, it is, but it's a wonderful, wonderful history. Did your parents live to see you graduate from the university?
Yes, on a rainy day in June, at what was then Memorial Stadium. Yes, they did, and it was a glorious moment for them,
yes,
and for me.
Sure. Did you major in journalism, Jim?
Yes.
You did.
I did.
So very focused.
The progression then for people from the Iron Range, which pioneered in the junior college system. Minnesota did, and California, Texas did, but it wasn't common throughout the country. But the kids up there could go to the first 2 years of college practically without payment, and the credits carried were transferred without question if they were reasonable grades to the University of Minnesota. And so hundreds of kids from the Iron Range with 2 years in college then could attend the university or other Minnesota 4-year colleges.
And is that then what you did?
Yeah.
Ah. And what year did you graduate?
In 1950.
1950, okay. When you think of good journalists, what do you think are the characteristics that make for stellar journalists?
Well, I think first of all, there has to be a strong ethic. Especially if you're involved in sensitive kind of writing, political writing, social justice, probing, and you have to have freedom to probe. And we had that. Journalism in the last, I need hardly tell you, is undergoing tremendous trauma. And so that the print journalism that we knew of 20 and 30 and 40 years and further back is slowly receding. The quality, the size of it, the impact of it, its audiences, its circulation, and especially in the economic downturn of the last year or two. And of course, the development of television.
Kind of a perfect storm, hasn't it been?
And the internet, and now especially the internet. And you see it every day in the newspaper. The newspaper invites the public in. It's like the television websites asking for hits, because this goes to the advertisers, and this is why you're constantly asked, what's your opinion on it? Because it matters to demonstrate the reach of your product. And so newspapering now is absolutely overrun with bloggers, some of them very good, some of them very bright, a lot of them kooks, some of them needing an audience and finding it. But that's been a big development in the media of today in America.
Do you think bloggers have terribly hurt journalism?
No, I don't think so. I think in many ways they've added some breadth to it, and certainly a lot of dimension. You have the public literally now has a stage. And so, no, I think you find some papers that I've read, the columnists are actually competing with the bloggers in whimsy, humor, sticking it to a losing coach,
right,
that sort of thing. And so in some ways, we have a journalism today across America which is not the kind of journalism I knew of 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. Especially, well, let's talk about the field of athletics, for example. You have witch hunts today, which are common.
Right.
And following the public anger of a losing season. The writing today, I think, is uniformly better than it was when I entered journalism. The education level, the exposure of the writers to a higher kind of development, all of these things make, I think, a more responsible, or at least a writer with more information than we have, more latitude in how you write.
And explain that, Jim, when you say more latitude.
Well,
what do you mean?
back in the 1940s and 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, a reporter was a reporter, charged with delivering the news, reporting it, the facts, please, you know. And
nothing but the facts.
You know, but now we get interpretive writing and need to. Because the newspapers are competing with the television, the investigative reporters in newspaper and competing with the networks, competing with themselves. So there is much more range in the writing of today. And a lot of it is positive for the public. Some of it, I think we might have had a tougher standard of what gets into the newspaper 40 years ago than we do today. Sometimes there's hearsay in it. But what I see in the Twin Cities newspapers, generally I like. Producing a newspaper under difficult conditions, without the budgets they had before, without the readers they had before.
What do you think of the trend, certainly here with the StarTribune, Pioneer Press, to focus more on local news rather than national or international?
Well, you don't have the money today to, the StarTribune 30 and 40 years ago operated a major Washington bureau, and many newspapers did. The Coles publications in Minneapolis and in Des Moines both had substantial, or writers serving both newspapers, substantial Washington staffs. You have staffs today, but not as large. You don't have the money to dig into a story that you may have had 30 and 40 years ago.
So is it primarily a money economic?
Well, a lot of it is, sure, it is. But a lot of the material you see in the newspaper today is a product of our times, a response to television, the expansiveness of television, and what people now get on the internet.
And the constancy of CNN, for example.
Oh, sure. And so it's much harder. It was a difficult job the newspaper had covering the wacky airline story here of a couple of days ago.
Right.
Depending on when we're airing here, of a couple of months ago.
I'll tell the audience we're taping on October 26th, 2009.
Well, this is a story that the airliner that overshot Minneapolis by 150 miles.
We're still waiting to hear what happened.
Yeah, and it was difficult to get to that because the newspaper doesn't have the resources that it had once before. And as a matter of fact, in the early days of the coverage of that story, a lot of the news came out of networks in Washington and New York, or some of it. So
So you think years ago we would have had more answers
bigger
at
staff
this
to
time
handle it. I'm
already.
not saying that the newspapers didn't handle it well under the conditions. I thought they do, and plus a lot of the information wasn't available, a lot of speculation. How could it have happened? And but I have to respect, and I'm happy to respect the performance of the two major newspapers in the Twin Cities in the last 3 or 4 years, working under conditions that are hard for the paper.
When you think of all the columns you wrote and all the books, Jim, you've written 23, which must be some kind of a record for a local author. I'm not sure.
I'm embarrassed to admit it.
Well, no, it shows how excited you are about writing.
Yes, and I guess the range of my involvement in journalism over the years, I treasure that.
And a wide range of topics, from your own story with alcoholism to micro grants to sports now to favorite essays and columns.
And the wild country, the
Right
mountains.
adventures, hiking the Matterhorn. I don't know if I've ever met quite a broadly focused man. But what's been well, this is probably a question you've been asked a million times, but your favorite column or the thing you enjoyed writing the most?
I think it was my grandmother. We talked about the immigrant ethic of America. My grandmother was the matriarch of the family.
On your mother's side?
On my mother's side.
On your mother's.
She was a lady named Rose from Slovenia, and she came to America with her flap on her lapel. She couldn't read English, couldn't speak it very well, knew a couple of words. She died sometime about 30 years ago. I was her first grandchild, and large family. And she was a woman who gave me my first Christmas gift and the grandmother's last kiss. And we loved each other. And she was full of fun, and I remember her. She was a typical immigrant from the old country. There wasn't a lot of money in the early years on the range, and they made sausage, and I remember her grinding this sausage on Saturday mornings late in fall. Many of the families would kill a pig and then create sausage the rest of the day. And she did this at her grinder, and she would try to talk to me in her best English, and she tried to steer, you mentioned mentors in our lives, and tried to steer me in the direction she thought was right, and of course my mother did and Dad, but we had a special relationship. And when she died, I thought about my life in a mining town growing up and what I'd learned from her and the opportunities I had that she and her husband never had in the old country. And I tried to consider what were the dreams of this young woman arriving at Ellis Island, unable to speak, frightened and yet excited. And when she died, we gathered the whole family and of course the service, and we sang the songs that she sang from the foothills of Slovenia. And I said at the time that I didn't know what her dreams were, but I do know what she meant to us, and that her time in America was at a time when thousands, millions of immigrants came to America at a time it needed workers, and their hunger for identity somehow meshed with this country's restless search for fulfillment. And they fed each other's dreams. And so I said I didn't know what her dreams were of her child, but I do know what she meant to us and the trust that was in the faces of all of those people who gathered at her death and who do not want today because of her sacrifice. And I'm glad I wrote this because it was the story of millions of people.
A personification of our early
America, what happened in America. And emerging from the desperate conditions of the Great Depression when I was a boy. And it wasn't settled yet. When World War II came and America became the leader in World War II, and afterwards the great middle class evolved in America. She was part of all of that. And then America was unstoppable, a great country. And it's a time to cherish.
So writing about her very personally, I'm sure impacted everyone who had immigrant family members.
In fact,
most of us.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you write a newspaper column for 35 or 40 years, you get responses, not like you do today, because people have the computer, of course, to respond, and the cell phone. we didn't have on that. But that column drew 4 times the response of anything I heard.
Is that right?
By the thousands.
Is that right?
And they identified, people identified with my grandma.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question.
Yeah.
Now, you and Bud Grant, I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about your observations about sports leaders. And you worked with Bud to do this book, and the book is called Always on Sunday. We'll hold it up in a few minutes. But he certainly has the respect, I think, for most Minnesotans of being a great leader in the world of sports.
Well, he was.
Do you think he viewed himself in that regard?
No, I don't think so. He had pride in what he did, as any leader would, as any man excelling in his work would, or any woman excelling in her work would. Of course, he had pride in that. He said that he considered himself more a builder than a coach. In other words, and I related with that because of whatever positive is in my life, I would include building of communities. It's always excited me to do that. In a moment I'll talk about Grant, but about Bud and his building. But I like the idea. People hunger for community in a variety of ways.
And interaction and connection.
Yeah, and they do need connection, and sometimes there's safety in community and excitement in it, a sense of belonging, all of that, whole variety of community.
A lot of psychology here,
well, so I would teach a football clinic for women.
Yes.
200 at a time.
You did
I
that,
loved it. And we did this through the newspaper. And I brought together 90 teenagers, would you believe, for a weekend of canoeing in the boundary waters of North Dakota. I'm not boasting about
challenge.
this. Well, and I enjoyed, I had the forum for that. I could bring people together. And I really was grateful for that opportunity. Way back in the 1970s, when open heart surgery and the bypass that has saved my life was not available. A man in northeast Minneapolis needed heart surgery desperately. The university here had been doing that for a while, then they stopped for a couple of years. And the only way this man could be saved would be to go to Stanford, which was the only institution then that operated on the heart in the way we do today, or something close to that. Family had no money, and a member of the family called me. So I organized the community and a fund for him, and at least 25,000 people donated. They organized parties. They would have parties, cheese parties, all around the city, and raised the $50,000 necessary to send him to Stanford.
I have to interrupt you and tell you this is so
And 2 days later, before he had an opportunity, he died. Yeah.
Just today, I'm at my beauty shop getting my hair fixed a bit, and my operator says, "And who are you interviewing today, Mary?" And I said, "Jim Klobuchar." She said, "I have to tell you what he did for my brother." And this was her brother.
Yes.
And I hadn't heard the story from you, and to have you now spontaneously bring it up,
Yeah.
she said, "What a good man!" And
Yeah.
I mean, there is an example of community building.
Because
in the
I
most
had the
basic
forum
way.
to do that, yes.
Yes,
And
but you used it
and
well.
Bud would say that a builder, development of values in the players who played for him, and seeing values in them. When you will ask Bud Grant today, could you coach pro football of today?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's not going to say yes. He's not going to say no. What he said was it would be hard. It would be hard because of the values he had. Bud Grant was able to command the respect of his players first because football players of today and football players of 50 years ago are alike in one condition. They are insecure. I don't care whether you make $10 million, they are insecure because there may be a draft choice right now challenging a guy making $10 million. And they're insecure that way. They're insecure partly because some of them are millionaire vagabonds, and a lot of them. Bud Grant would conclude practice on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and where a lot of coaches then and today will stay in the office, sleep in the office, stay there until 3 o'clock in the morning, many of them, because they are driven to find the last answer to a play, what they may need to win, that sort of thing. He didn't do it. He went home at 5 o'clock and fed his dogs, his hunting dogs, and he went home to play with his children.
So a balanced life.
A balance. They saw that in him, respected it, and envied it, and they listened when he talked.
There's a quote in your book, Jim Marshall, the very famous defensive end, says, I always said that if I ever found myself trapped in the jungle with lions out there somewhere, and I had my choice of one guy to get me out of there, the guy was Bud Grant. So that's a high compliment.
Well, he was a pragmatist. He knew how to get out of trouble if he got into it. I don't mean trouble with the law. I mean trouble with trouble with the schedule and other things, and with a game coming up. He never pretended that he was a genius as a strategist. He didn't do the game plans. Other coaches did that.
Jim, we're putting on the screen right now the book cover, so you can all get a peek at it. I'm getting the signal that we're almost out of time.
Oh my God! Well, this book is a tale of two eras. The football of 20 and 30 years ago that a lot of them were elderly fans recognize, and were Viking fans then, and what's the colossus that pro football has become today.
Yeah, it's, as I said, it's a really fun read. And I wish we had another 2 hours.
I do too.
Thank you very much.
Invite me back.
This has been great. I will. We'll do some more
Okay.
conversing. Thank you for being with us. I've been with the wonderful leader in the field of journalism, Jim Klobuchar. Have a good week. See you soon.